Hello Tarot people and welcome to Let's Talk Tarot. We are on a voyage of discovery through the allegorical trump cards of the tarot known as the Major Arcana. We have now arrived at card 13, which is kind of special because in some decks it doesn't have a name. In other decks it is called Death. So go and get your last and final cup of tea as we go towards death. Welcome back. So today it is time for us to administer the final rites because we are on card number 13, also known as Death. As I said last time, this card can cause some anxieties and concerns, so it's really important as tarot card readers we allay those fears as soon as they arise in our readings. Before we jump onto the card's meaning and a little bit more about this card, for those of you new to my channel, I use two different decks to illustrate my videos. For those of you that aren't new, this is going to be the 13th time you've heard this, so let me see how fast I can get through it. So, for those of you that are new, I use a card that is based on the Tarot de Marseille, which is a French traditional style of tarot that was very popular in the 1600s and 1700s. This specific deck is called the Veritable Tarot de Marseille by Chris Hadder, who restored the 1760s Nicholas Conver deck. So when I use this card, I'm referencing a historical form of tarot that was used for gaming before it was used for divination. I will also be referring to this card, which is the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, named after the artist Pamela Coleman Smith and the person who commissioned it, Arthur Edward Waite. A. Waite was a member of mystical orders and occult schools, so quite a lot of these cards are based on occult symbolism. This was published in 1999. There are some versions that are 1920s. So this is a much later form of tarot that is influenced by occult ideas and is really designed for divination. Both of these cards most modern decks are based on, so even if they are not a Tarot de Marseille or a Rider-Waite-Smith deck, they will be based normally on one of the two. However, it is possible that you have a deck in front of you that does not base its imagery on one of these two cards, and that is because the artist or designer has decided to step outside of the tradition of these and create something new, which is really cool. But it means that some of the smaller, finer details that I point out on the cards might not refer on your deck. But that's fine, because every single insinuation or meaning that you can derive from that will still be present in that card that you have in front of you. It just means that that specific piece of imagery might not be present. There are tarot decks that are earlier, sometimes we refer to them. There are tarot decks that are between these, and there are tarot decks that are after these. It is only because these are generally seen as relatively standard that I am using these to illustrate my videos. Cool. Welcome back for those of you that have seen that now 13 times. Let us crack on. Before we look at the symbolism and the imagery in this card, let me talk about the name first. I mentioned in the intro video that sometimes this doesn't have a name, and that puts it into an interesting exception of tarot. I said in the introduction to the Major Arcana that there are two cards that fall outside my general rule of every card having three things, if you remember. I said that they all have a number, a name, and an image. This is one of the two that doesn't have one of those three. This one doesn't have a name in the traditional historical tarot. So when you see the Tarot de Marseille, like here, you will see that it doesn't have a name. It only has a number. The other card was the Fool, which we have yet to do. We're doing that at the end. But that doesn't have a number, but it does have a name. So it's kind of like the reverse. That makes them as kind of a special exception. There's also some interesting links between those two cards, especially in the Tarot de Marseille tradition. So I'm going to just show you quick. So let me just jump down to here and turn on my drawing pad which is always a little bit timely. So here you can see I have put the Fool card, but I have put it slightly off kilter. You will see that some of the card is missing, and I've done that on purpose. And you will see just now. So what I've done is I've put the Death card, or the Unnamed Arcana, underneath it. So let me just reduce down the opacity, and you'll see why. Seeing it? So as you can see, there are similarities between these two cards. You can see that the staff of the magician here is the same angle as the scythe. So when I do them overlapping like this, you can kind of really see this relationship between the two, that they're almost the same character. They're just the stance ever so slightly changes. So you can see that the Fool is looking upwards and out with his head held high, and then the Death card, or the Arcana without a name, is now looking a little bit more haunched and a little bit further ahead rather than up. Yeah, so you can see that these cards seem to have a relationship, a very special relationship. This is not always the same in all Marseille Tarot. Some Marseille Tarot has the Death card facing the other way, and some people will say that that is more traditional, that the earlier Tarot Marseilles were supposedly the reverse of this. And the reason why we've got it reversed in some decks is because the printing blocks were not copied correctly. They were kind of copied in the mirror image, but it still gives that wonderful relationship, whether it is a definite mimic like I've just shown you, or whether it is mirrored and the Fool is facing Death and Death is facing the Fool. So there is definitely a link between these two exceptions in the tarot, that one doesn't have a name, one doesn't have a number, and there is this visual link between the two that I find quite striking. I always look for tarot cards in the Marseille that show this link and doesn't show the mirrored version, because I just think it's so special. One of the meanings behind this could be seen as that the Death is actually the Fool, and therefore it's about beginnings, it's about startings. So here the Fool has, before, we're not going to go too deeply on this because it'll be part of the other video on the Fool, but here the Fool is leaving everything behind. It doesn't really matter where he's come from, he's taking very few possessions forward. And here on the Death card, it's kind of cutting away the past, removing the past, and walking on regardless. So it's about almost killing the past, cutting it down, reaping the past, reaping any connection. So in one way we are positively leaving what's behind and jumping forward. In another one we are cutting what's behind and moving slowly forward. So there's a little bit of difference, but there's similarities. So you can see both of these cards as a transition. One of them is leaping forward relatively naively. The other one is in a position where they have to cut what's behind to move forward. Cool. So the other way you could see it is that the Fool will eventually come to obstacles. So whether you see the 0 at the start of the tarot deck or at the end or wherever you see him, and that cutting of the obstacles that will eventually be in the Fool's journey is cut down by Death, which is just another version of the Fool. Isn't that cool? Okay, so I could do that all day, switching between the two of them, so I will move on. I will drop that down to Death for us to play around with later, and then I will leave it. So because of that link, it does have a special relationship with one other card. It has that special relationship with the Fool. And as such, we already know that it might not necessarily mean physical death. It's not necessarily physical death because it's linked to such a lively other card. That's about beginning, start, moving on. It can't be about the ends. And some writers mentioned that because it's the 13th card and not the 21st card or the 22nd card or whatever, it can't be about ends because it is in basically the center of the deck. It is at 13 of 22 cards, so therefore it is a transition, it's a moving over. And we see that a little bit in its number. So the number of this card, jumping over to numerology a little bit, is 13. So if we see 12 being the zodiac, a wheel of the year, and then we get to the 13th, it's the start of a new cycle, it's the start of a new year. We also see that link between 13 and the year in the number of lunar cycles in a year. We see 13 being the number of moon cycles or menstrual cycles, if that applies to you. So there is something to do with the annual year and the number 13. And here we see death as kind of like the end of the year and the start of the next year. So anything that has gone from the start of the year, planted in the start of the year, is being harvested now and cut back down. So it's about the finishing off of what's gone before and the preparation of going on to the new. So it's a transition phase. And we saw in the 12th that we had the Hanged Man, and he was going into that kind of chrysalis form. He was looking to transform into something new, and now we see death being this transitional stage. We see it as emerging as a butterfly, but interestingly, it's not more adorned, more beautiful. It's stripped back. It's removing the flesh of the self, so therefore removing the ego. Anyway, I'm jumping over the place a little bit, so let me move back over to the number. Now I've explained the exception. So the number is number 13. The number 13 can be seen as going back down to root numbers 1 to 9 in a couple of ways. So you could see it as the 1 and the 3. So a second order of 3 because we are in the tens. The 3 is the Empress. So there is something very feminine about the 13. We can see it as 1 plus 3 going down to 4, which is the Emperor. So we can see it about structures. Especially if we see it as a Saturnine thing, which I kind of make a mention of in the Hermit. So Saturn is about, it can be about death and what's beyond death, and sometimes Saturn is seen as a skeleton or a reaper of sorts, and it's about cutting down foundations and breaking down foundations to build something new. So we can see that link there to organisation and structure in the 4. Just broken apart a little bit. The other thing it can be is a link to the 1 or the Magician, so there is something spiritual about this and something to do with tools and abilities. I would be very remiss if I didn't point out that 13 can be seen as an unlucky number. There is this whole thing of triskaidekaphobia, the fear of the number 13, and some people think that it's an extremely unlucky number, and there are some cultures that see it as kind of lucky. The Western view of it being unlucky probably derives from the idea of 13 people at the Last Supper. So Jesus and his 12 disciples, and the 13th guest was Judas, who would then cause the death of Jesus, the physical death of Jesus for his rebirth. So sometimes it is linked to a negative thing and an evil thing. In the tarot, that's not the case. It's very neutral. You know, it is just about a process of nature. Even when it's like referencing that physical death, it's death as nature. It's a death as breaking down the old and re-emergence of the new, which you'll see in the symbolism. So there are, I did make a mention of lunar cycles. In a year, in a solar year, there is 12.41 lunar cycles in a year. But we can kind of roughly see there's about 13 moons in a lunar year. So there is a link to moon cycles. There is a link to lunar energy with this card. Cool. So the other thing that we can see it as is a breakdown of the perfection of the 12s. If you remember, we said that 12 was highly factorial. There was a lot of ways of dividing it, and it's actually probably one of the most divisible numbers when we look in the tarot that there is. Yeah, we can do it as 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 4 and 3. So we've kind of gone from a really beautifully perfect number, very symmetrical number in Zodiac, and then we've moved on to this kind of lumpy prime. You know, we've got this number 13 that can only be divided by itself and 1. And we've kind of broken down that perfection. So we can see it as a breakdown of perfection, which is sometimes why it's linked as negative, but we can also see that as breaking down perfect structures, breaking it down to its root, in order to restart, new starts and new transformations. So that is roughly the number symbolism of this card. Let us move to the imagery. Here we go. So the Rider-Waite-Smith always makes me think of the Roman folklore thing about victors after battle. The kind of the layout of the floor makes me kind of always remind me of the results of a battle. Yeah, dead bodies strewn everywhere, and then we have this victor warrior, like he's wearing all this armor and he's marching in on the back of a horse. So it makes me think of a victor of war. There is the saying memento mori that is sometimes linked to this and Roman mythology. So the legend is that when a victor came back from war, they went on a parade to show how victorious they are and how wonderful they were, and they'd have great big huge crowds cheering them on and celebrating their victory. What they apparently did, and I don't know whether this is true or not, but it is certainly the legend, is that they used to have a slave behind the victorious warrior, standing behind them on the chariot or on the horse, and they'd whisper in their ear. They'd whisper. I'm going to, for those that are classicists of language, I'm going to be using the ecclesiastic pronunciation, so forgive me. But they used to whisper in Latin, respice post te, hominem te esse memento mori. What that roughly translates to is, look behind you, remember that you're only mortal, and remember that you have to die too. Yeah, I added a few words there, like the two's not really there. Yeah. So that reminds the victor that this victory is temporary and that they are too mortal, and they're not immortal, they're not godly, they will die too. And it's that memory of death, and remembering that everything is just transitory, that we may be victorious today, but tomorrow we may not be victorious. So this is also something to do with this card for me. It's about that linking of what happens today may be different tomorrow, and that transition and change that is very prevalent. One person's success isn't necessarily going to last all the day. And some people comment that death is the great equalizer, that it comes to all of us because we are just part of nature. It links us to that natural world. And in the cards you will often see like a king with his crown in the dirt. And here we go. In the Tarot de Marseille, we've got a person here that's just a normal person, and we've got a person here with a crown to kind of symbolize that they're royalty. So it's really saying that we all die the same, you know, that there's no difference in class when it comes to death. And death certainly is this energy that applies to everyone. When we even look at it as transitional and transformation, that applies to everyone. Just because you are successful one day doesn't necessarily mean that you will be successful the next. And when that happens, if that is a drop, or from success down to poverty, that is a transformation of death, and it will treat everyone equally. So there is this memento mori kind of feeling about this card. The other thing that this Rider-Waite-Smith card is really based on, for me, is that text of Revelations in the Bible, where it talks about the four horsemen of the apocalypse. So we have the white horse here. So I looked, and lo, and behold, the ashen horse, and he who was sat on it had the name of Death. So Revelations is saying that the horse is ashen or white or pale or pallid, and the person that rides on the white horse is Death, which is probably what Waite used to choose this imagery. There is another translation of Revelations from the Greek. The Greek word that was translated to ashen or white or pallid can also be translated to kind of say yellowish green, like putrid colour. So occasionally Death is seen as riding on a kind of a yellowishy green horse, but not here. Waite's chosen white. So this is very, very based on Christian mythology and a kind of mysticism, which is what we kind of expect from the Order of the Golden Dawn. So here on the imagery, actually I'm going to jump over to the desk again, and I'm just going to point out a couple of bits. So when we look at this card, let me just pop on the brush and change to a lurid green colour. So there's not a lot of hidden symbols here, but we do have some overt. Often in the Tarot de Marseille versions of these cards, we see the colour red touching certain points. So we see it here. It's very subtle here because it's not lasted the throes of history. We see it here. We see it here on the shoulder and here on the neck, and we sometimes see it here on the base of the spine. This always makes me think of joint pain and arthritis. So when I see this card, especially if it's around health, I kind of sometimes think about bone health and inflammation, and especially inflammation around joints and joint pain. So it is just a quirky thing about the Marseille. It does seem to have these kind of red splodges that appear on the joints, and I do kind of link it to that. The other thing is this hand here is sometimes seen in the sign of benediction, which we spoke about in the Hierophant card, if you remember. There's two fingers being extended and two wrapped around, which is a sign of blessing in the Roman Catholic tradition. We said that it descended from St. Peter, and we also kind of made a mention that it could have been the fact that he had a tendon problem in his hand, but basically everyone copied him as the sign of blessing. So there is a link here to kind of almost a church or a saintly person, and the fact that they are blessing but they were still knocked down too. So it's still part of this equalizing, that we've got a king here, we've got what looks like a queen here on this card, but sometimes just has long hair. And we have a religious person's hand here. So it's just linking once again to everyone's equal in the eyes of this energy, which here in the tarot is transformation, but in the imagery is of death. We have an interesting dark colour. We don't tend to see this an awful lot in the Tarot de Marseille, but this is kind of like either really dark green or black occasionally on the thing. This is kind of, I think, the only card that has this dark colour on the ground, and it's linking it to that kind of barren death, but also that alchemical ideal of putrefaction, like the blackness, the start of any kind of operation in alchemy, and it's about dissolution, breaking things down into their base structures before allowing them to bloom up through the alchemical processes. And here in the ground we have all these plants. You see them? They're kind of blossoming up. So we can't really see this as just about death, because we've got all this life going on here as well. Things are springing up from these the hierarchies of society being cut down. So we have also got this card of life. And Waite is a big fan of the link here between life and death on this card, and we'll look at that a little bit there. So we are talking about it as a transitional state between death and life. So a few other things that are normally pointed out with the Tarot de Marseille is that the bones are not white coloured or grey coloured or even this kind of mysteriously blue coloured on the spine, but are flesh coloured most often. You see that? That's kind of like a pinky flesh colour. And it's kind of hinting that this being is one of life and it's not one of death. This is kind of linking it to the life factor in the tarot. You know, it's the same colour as people's faces, as you can see here, and it's the same colour as living things. So it is also linking even the figure of death with the idea of life. The yellow here on the scythe is sometimes linked to the idea of earth and the energies of the earth, and you can certainly do that if you want. We can see this, if you do, as kind of linking to the agricultural god Saturn again. Yeah, so Saturn, or Kronos, the ruler of time. He originally was an agricultural god, and thus the symbol of the scythe was for harvesting. So we can kind of link it to kind of that. That is roughly it on the symbolism here. Some versions of the tarot, especially when they've been restored, for example like Jodorowsky and Camois, they add a few extra symbolism and they hide extra symbols in it. They sometimes put like the four-lettered name of God in the skull. Sometimes they put like a hidden heart in the body. But generally speaking, that's not really traditional. So this is the kind of most traditional points. So let us move on to looking at the images in the cards again. So the differences with my card is that we've got here a red dot on the spine and the blue dot here. I sometimes kind of link this to the idea of because let me step back a little bit further before I say that point. We've got a skeleton, so sometimes you could see this as being paired back to the bare bones, that which is immortal or long lasting of the person. But we can also link it to the removing of ego and the removing of personality and stripping back to the kind of the bare essentials. So when I see this red dot and this blue dot here on my cards, which isn't always in every single card, they sometimes colour them slightly differently, I think about that basal chakral energy and this throat chakra energy, yeah, and they are pretty much coloured that. So Chris Haddar has coloured it almost as if it is linking to those kind of energies. So I see this as kind of almost repressed anger and see this as unexpressed emotion, and that's part of this transformation. You know, we've kind of getting to the point where in the previous card the Hanged Man has sacrificed something, has gone through some sort of spiritual trial. And here we've got this stripping back of the ego and laying bare these very raw emotions and kind of expressing them. And those emotions are sometimes dragged from the past, taken from the past. So here we have a figure cutting down the past, getting cutting through the ties that we have to our past, sometimes seen as mother and father or whatever that is, and therefore this unexpressed anger and unexpressed resentment may kind of arise and need to be expressed. So sometimes this card can kind of symbolize the need to be seeing a therapist for that transitional stage, for that transitional nature. That's a very psychological interpretation, and some of you might not really like that, so just discard that and kind of take what you want. But that's what I kind of see also about this card, is that it is stripping back of the ego, like a Jungian kind of process, and stripping past the past away by understanding it and just kind of cutting it on. It is a forward-focused card. We are not reminiscing about the past. We are mostly working out what the past has ties on us in the present, and we are getting ready to move ahead by cutting it down and cutting it away and stripping it back. Cool. So that's pretty most of the symbols that are present on the TDM deck, and that kind of links that pretty nicely. Here we have a few more. We have this rose is sometimes seen as the mystic rose. It's called the mystic rose by Rider-Waite. It's kind of linked to the Rosicrucian orders that he was involved in. It's also a secret little hidden message referring to Mary, the mother of Jesus, because sometimes she's called the mystic rose. We see death here knighted like an armour, and as I said, that kind of links to me for that memento mori, but it can be seen as a victor, a battle, or a part of the Apocrypha in Revelations. Here we have a bishop or a religious figure that's standing up and pleading with death. You'll notice that he's the only one that's standing. Everyone else is either dead or kneeling. So sometimes this can be kind of interpreted as having those faith and that structure of religion helps us face death. It helps us kind of handle those transitions. We have got, let me refer to these people. So we've got a child here that's looking at death, and it's kind of like almost like innocence. Innocence is able to handle things that they don't fully understand, or they may understand, but they've not built up the years of meaning that an adult has. So for an adult, it's pretty hard to kind of face death, but for an innocent child, it might be better. We kind of have that hint here with this young adult, maybe teenager, maybe, who is fair enough, still kind of kneeling, facing, but turning her head away. So she's starting to not really handle the idea of death and the concept of death, and it's only the religious figure that is able to kind of look. Here in the background we have the rising sun between two pillars. So the two pillars could be the pillars of Solomon. They could be a reference to the old temple. They could also be a reference to other tarot cards, which we'll mention when we get to them. But the sun here is rising. It's symbolizing life and light. And once again, the white rose is talking about life, and the idea of the white horse is talking about life. So we've got this interplay between life and death. And what Rider-Waite is really trying to say is that it's not about physical death. It's not really about anything to do with death. It's kind of like a hidden initiation, a hidden transitional state for someone. So it's an initiation of some sort. Now on my card this is not very clear, so I'm going to show you this on the 1909 published, but there is actually a hidden little symbol that has kind of caused some interest on the Rider-Waite-Smith. So for the very first time in this series I get to talk about the Rider-Waite-Smith. So let me just jump over to my desktop and let me just enlarge this. Here we go. So here we are with the 1909 version of the Pamela Coleman Smith. The lines are a lot clearer. You can see very clearly now, let me just zoom in. You can see very clearly now that we have a crown that's fallen off the king's head. In mine, it's all a bit splotchy. And here we've got this really interesting, beautiful spiral, which I'm not quite sure what it is, but it's just stunning. And we can see the jewels on the back, and they're circles with crosses through, which is a kind of reference to the earth. But what we do also have in the background, we can see a river here with a boat, which is about crossings, it's about transformation, it's about going between life and death. So it's about that initiation journey again. But here, can you see this little arrow? Yeah. It's supposed to be the spare of the boot, but it really looks like an arrow. And if we follow that arrow, we get a hidden cave. It's really hard to see on my actual physical cards that were produced by US Games, but here it's slightly easier to see, and we can very clearly see, if I move it across, that these are trees, and there is definitely a cave of some sort. This is like the cave of initiations. This could be seen as the cave of the subconscious. But there is definitely this reference to pointing towards a cave. And Rider-Waite kind of mentions that a little bit in Pictorial Key to the Tarot, but in a very secretive way. So there is definitely a hidden cave in this card. Make of that what you will. But it is a kind of nice hidden symbol, and it does kind of reference those initiation myths and ideas and transformation more so. So there you go. There is a hidden symbol in the Rider-Waite card for the first time. So that pretty much covers the symbolism hidden in this card. There is, you can see here, not so clearly as I could shown you on my computer, but the skull and crossbones that is going on. This is kind of very Templar almost and Rosicrucian-esque. So it's just more references to that. But that pretty much covers that card. So let's talk about the meaning of that card. I'm aware that I'm rubbing my nose. It's because I've got really itchy. I think either a dog hair or something is attacking my face. So I've talked about quite a lot of different meanings already about this card, linking to where I've kind of pointed them out in symbolism. The key meaning or key kind of phrase of this card I would take from the great philosopher Elsa, let it go. Because it's kind of linking that transformation process. So the advice of this is from the philosopher Elsa, of let it go, let it be, don't hold on to too much, just let it transform. So that's like the key advice of this card. The key meaning is one of transformation. It can be about that new initiation between a state of being and a new state of being. So it is important to kind of let the past go. And as you can see, when I was talking about the linking to that repressed anger or that resentment, holding on to that will not allow you to move beyond the death card. It will be too much of a hold and a tie onto what has happened beforehand in whatever way, and therefore it won't let you transition and move on to the next cards. The other thing that it can be seen as I mentioned, was that stripping back to the ego. So here we don't have any flesh, we don't have any face, we don't have any personality. We are stripping it back to what is immortal, what lasts forever, the bones of a person, which is to take back that ego and to take back that personality, to remove those quirks and things of the person that are unique and individual, to allow them to tie into greater consciousness, to the greater unconsciousness, and connect better with the divine. So this kind of removing of ego is not necessarily a negative thing. It seems to be always referred to as something unnecessary for spiritual development, and I kind of recognize that. But as like ex-psychotherapist, I can also recognize that the ego is a very important thing, and it's part of the personality, and it's part of the person's life experience. So what it is it's stripping back the unnecessary. The other thing that it can talk about is it can talk about the ends of things. We're obviously at a point where something is ending and something else is beginning. So it can reference an end to something. And that end can be pretty traumatic or pretty destructive. Because of that link to Saturn, it is about kind of cutting things down to their foundation, and it is about rocking those foundations. So if this card comes up, it could be quite a rough and jumpy and bumpy time, and it depends on how much someone holds on to the past whilst they're trying to transition to the future, of how rough that can be. The other thing that it can be is to kind of cut something down. And sometimes when you're laying a card, the next card next to death will tell you what it's cutting if it's facing in the front way, because as you can see, that scythe is cutting something here. So whatever we lay here in this position is kind of almost saying what you're cutting out, what you're cutting down. So it can be a link to kind of talking about the removing of something, the cutting down of something, the finalizing of something. It can also talk about eliminating something, and whatever it is will be the next card. And it can also be talking about breaking down barriers, as we talked about when we were referencing it to the Fool. The other thing it can talk about very easily is harvest. We are here looking at a scythe which is used to cut down grain, so it can be about the completion of something. Referring back to the 12 and looking at the zodiac, it can be about completing something and knowing that you've kind of harvested in the fruits of that. You know, sometimes a client is asking about, you know, is something finished, is something ended? And even if it's something positive like the start of a new business, we are talking about, yes, celebrate the finishing of that first phase, and we're just about to move on to the next phase. It's the kind of card that I expect to kind of almost get, but I do these films in filming schedules of 7 of basically a whole septenary. So it's the kind of the card that I expect to get between those sets. It's like, I finish this, cut that back, remove that, celebrate my success and definitely harvest it, but then get ready for the next phase, look ahead at the next task. So the other thing it can be is about transformation and also death as an initiation. So it can be talking about initiations of some sort, whether that's an initiation par excellence, like in religious terms and neo-religious terms, like, I don't know, like entering into the Order of the Golden Dawn, or into the OTO, or into witchcraft, or even into the Roman Catholic Church. So it can reference those because it is about a spiritual death and a spiritual rebirth. But it can also very, very, very seldomly and rarely link to death, but it's normally about what comes after that. So it can reference like a mourning period. It can reference what happens when someone has passed away and how we are coping with that, and the process of working through the corn of our lives, harvesting the good and moving on from the bad, and allowing that unexpressed anger, resentment, or just emotion and grief to be expressed in the best possible way. So it can very rarely kind of link to mourning periods around death. It can also talk about old age and decomposition or decomposing, because we have a hunched figure that is obviously, from when we look at the Fool, we see a kind of a young sprightly person, and then this is like the end state of them. Yeah, we've moved on from that, so it can be seen as an older person. So that pretty much goes over all the kind of rough meanings to arm you when this kind of comes up on the table. As I said, as soon as this laid down in a reading, try to allay any fears of those that you're reading for. If you're reading for yourself, you don't have to worry about that too much, but if you are reading for friends, family, loved ones, or professionally, as soon as this lands on, you can give a little bit of a lighter interpretation before you get onto it. So you may have noticed this card on the table, which represents transformations and transitional states. It doesn't necessarily mean death or anything to do with death, so just be warned now at the moment that this is not necessarily about that, and we will come on to talking about that in a second. So that kind of thing, allay the fears and kind of allow people to move past the strong visual image. So I hope that's been helpful. If you are new to my channel, please subscribe below. There should be a little button down there somewhere. Please feel free to like, comment and share this video. I do answer my comments on a regular basis, so if you leave a question below, I will reply to it. If for those of you that do support me on Patreon, thank you very much. You are what keeps these videos going, but you also have a full handout cheat sheet, written document talking about everything that I've talked about in this video, so it's going to be quite long, on Patreon for you to print out, keep, jot over, write your notes down, and make you think a little bit harder. So that'll be available to you when this video goes live, which is a week earlier than the public get it. For those of you that don't support me on Patreon, please consider doing so. For a price of a digital cup of coffee, you help me produce these videos, plus more great resources, and you get extra bonus content and bonus videos on a lot of other subjects. So I hope that's been enjoyable and meaningful for you. If you need to get in contact with me, please just write a message below. Thank you very much for your time. Take care. Goodbye.